Now, at this time, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Her name is Maddy Johnson. She's a Master's of Science candidate at the Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries, University of Tennessee. And this is her study that she has underway and has been working on. We're going to be the first ones, I guess, Maddie, to get some of the feedback and findings that you've discovered. And I will say before I turn over to you that I feel like a lot of what you're learning can have applications not just in East Tennessee, but to the rest of the state of Tennessee. So with that, Maddie, I'm going to, we make our speakers introduce themselves in more detail. So if you'll tell us a bit more about yourself, the screen is yours.
All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen really quick. All right, can you guys see that?
Yes, looks good.
Awesome. All right, thanks so much for the introduction, Neil. As he said, I'm Maddy Johnson. I'm a first-year forestry master's student in the Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries here at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And just a little background on me, I grew up in Cincinnati and I graduated from the University of Dayton in 2020 with a BS in environmental biology from the University of Dayton. And I spent a year in AmeriCorps in Nashville with the Nashville Tree Foundation and the Harpeth Conservancy. And I really found my passion and interest in the aspect of community involvement and intersecting that with watershed and forestry management initiatives. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you guys today about evaluating potential for restoration of riparian buffers in communities of East Tennessee. So to get started with a quick outline, in this presentation, I will be introducing the Community Riparian Restoration Program for Tennessee, and then I will get into a little bit of background on riparian buffers, what they are, why we love them so much. Then we'll talk about the multifaceted concept of community involvement and get into some of the science behind why it's so essential for restoration. We'll get to know a little bit about our study area, East Tennessee, and talk about why this work is so important here. I'll then be going into the objectives of my master's research that will address the issues Tennessee faces when it comes to riparian buffer quality. And finally, we'll talk about where we're going in the future, how we're going to use the findings from our research to educate and promote the concept of riparian restoration across East Tennessee. So I would like to start off by introducing the program through which this webinar is made possible. The Community Riparian Restoration Program for Tennessee is an initiative funded by the Tennessee Division of Forestry and led by the UT Institute of Agriculture. And our main goal, my buttons, there we go. Okay, sorry. Our main goal is driving community involvement in riparian restoration through applied research. And so over the next 7 years, we'll be focusing on 4 main objectives in the different regions of Tennessee, focused on community involvement in riparian restoration, starting in East Tennessee. So these objectives are community education in watershed restoration. So this will include not only compiling a digital library of guides and resources to aid public understanding of riparian systems, but also creating in-person educational workshops for community members to participate in and develop an appreciation for riparian systems. Objective 2 is community engagement, and this will include networking and collaborating with watershed and forest management groups across East Tennessee to develop planting and community involvement plans for restoring high-need buffer zones. Objective 3 is development and dissemination of watershed materials. So we'll be developing some best practices for community engagement in riparian restoration, as well as creating informational and promotional signage for restored areas that educate people about our mission. And last but not least, Objective 4 is analysis of watershed health. So our goal here is to determine where our most high need buffers are for restoration and come to an understanding of what factors are connected to buffer quality and impairment and how we can address these issues that are in East Tennessee and Tennessee as a whole. So diving into some background information, what is a riparian buffer? So a riparian buffer is a unique type of forest that acts as a transitional area between land and water, and they can be along streams, lakes, reservoirs, rivers, and ideally they're comprised of a mix of vegetation. So native trees, shrubs, grasses, and flowering plants. And as with any type of forest, there are certain characteristics that contribute to its quality and function overall. So these photos to the right compare what would be considered a healthy buffer versus an impacted buffer. And you can see a healthy buffer, ideally it's comprised of many layers of native vegetation. So ideally it's a mature forest. So you can see native trees, some grasses and shrubs, whereas an impacted buffer might have more sparse vegetation, and it might be impacted, the understory might be shaded out by some sort of invasive species. I'm sure you guys are aware of honeysuckle and privet. Those are two really pervasive species in Tennessee that affect riparian buffer zones. So this would be considered impaired because of that. Another really important characteristic, how do I go back? There we go. There we go, is the width of the buffer. So the research kind of varies on what an ideal width would be, but depending on the size of the adjacent stream, it's usually about 30 to 40 feet of forested buffer on either side. So I'm kind of a nerd, and whenever I pass a stream or a river, I like to give the riparian buffer a rating out of 10. So I just wanted to show some examples of what I think are some really excellent riparian buffers. So with all three of these, you can see there's a really good diverse mix of vegetation. We have some mature trees, we have shrubs, flowering plants. I really like in this one how this tree is kind of shading the stream. So all of these are really excellent. I would give them like an 8 or 9 out of 10, maybe in this one right here because of the road, maybe a 7, but in general, these are all really healthy buffers that make me very happy. So I showed some good examples that make me happy. So now I have to show some that make me sad. Oops, there we go. Yeah, I would probably give this one a 1. You can see the vegetation is mowed all the way up to the bank. There's some really severe erosion going on that left bank over there. I'm going to give it a 1 because they do have a few trees, so that's something. But this one, I think we've all seen a stream like this somewhere around where we live. This one I would give a 0. There's really just nothing going on here. You can see there's pavement right here. So these ones would definitely be considered severely impaired. So riparian buffers are special for a lot of reasons, but one of them being that they provide disproportionately large ecosystem services for their stream habitats and surrounding habitats. So these ecosystem services include bank stabilization and erosion reduction, nutrient pollution reduction, and stormwater pollutant infiltration. They provide increased habitat and biodiversity, increases flood storage, and in general, communities that have healthier waterways and more green space have higher aesthetic and recreational value, which makes for happier communities. And the photo to the right just kind of illustrates that the wider the riparian buffer is, the more of these ecosystem services are achieved. So here on the most narrow end, those tree roots are providing some bank stabilization and erosion reduction, really holding that soil in place. Moving up, you get some improved water quality and nutrient pollution infiltration. Moving up, you get flood control, and that widest width right there is where you achieve optimum wildlife habitat. So moving on to the justification for our research. As I stated on the previous slide, riparian buffers are an essential part of a functional stream ecosystem, and they can help reduce effects from pollutants on our water quality. Unfortunately, in Tennessee, a lot of our streams actually don't meet state or federal standards for a variety of different reasons. And according to the most recent 305B report from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, and this report kind of just outlines sources and causes of stream impairment. About 15,000 of the 28,000 stream miles assessed were found to be impaired in some way, or about 55%. And this is from 2020, so this might be slightly different now. And just some important things that I'd like to point out from the chart to the right is that siltation or sedimentation and habitat alteration are some of the most common causes of stream impairment. And hydrologic modification and municipal discharges are some of the most common sources. So these sources and causes of stream impairment are very heavily related to destruction and alteration of the surrounding riparian habitat of a stream. So this is the loss of riparian forests is a very pervasive issue in Tennessee, as with other places in the United States, and it has pretty detrimental effects on our water quality. So as I kind of said before, Tennessee is definitely not alone in this issue. There are a significant percent of impaired streams in every state in the United States. And over the years, as the awareness and understanding of water quality and stream habitat issues has been increasing, there's been kind of a wider acceptance and implementation of river restoration projects. And there's kind of been that observed trend since about 1990. So this chart right here shows the number of completed projects since 1990. And you can see that is an exponential increase. And actually, as of 2007, the United States was spending about $1 billion annually on river restoration. So we're pumping all of this money, time, and resources into improving the quality of our rivers because we know it's important. So that kind of raises the question, is stream quality improving? Well, if you look at the same chart, this line right here shows the percent of impaired stream miles in the United States as a whole. And you can see that actually increased in that same amount of time, even just slightly. But that was, several decades ago. Let's look at something more recent and more local. So this chart right here is also from the most recent 305B report from TDEC. And it shows the percent of impaired versus unimpaired stream miles from 2010 to 2020. And if you look at this red right here, you can see that also increased during that time. And of course, this could be for a variety of reasons. Water or stream ecosystems are extremely complex, and it's hard to pinpoint one reason why they're getting more impaired. But in general, when asking the question, is stream quality improving? The answer is almost universally, not really. So clearly we have a long way to go when it comes to actually effective river restoration tactics. And riparian restoration is a deceptively complex process, and it's a lot more than just planting some trees and just hoping for the best. There's still a lot we don't know and need to research about what works and what doesn't. And beyond that, there are a lot of outside factors that contribute to the trend of failure that's been observed since the 90s that I talked about on the previous slide. So the first problem that a lot of riparian restoration projects face is a lack of post-restoration monitoring. So in order to be successful, it's important to record data before, during, and after a restoration project so you know what you're doing is achieving your desired results, and you can learn how to improve your future practices. So there needs to be more long-term data collection so water quality trends can be observed over time so that we can really document what works. Next is a lack of funding. It doesn't matter what field you work in. This is always going to be a problem to some extent. Not only are funds needed for initial implementation, but also for maintenance and monitoring as well. Next is a lack of organizational presence in a community. So we live in a world where nonprofit organizations fill in a lot of needs that government agencies don't have the time or resources to fill. And I live in Knoxville, and we're really lucky to have several nonprofit organizations that specifically focus on ecological restoration, as well as a university that acts as a hub of knowledge and resources dedicated to these issues. But Tennessee is a very diverse state. So it's not like that everywhere. In some of these smaller cities and towns and rural areas, they're much less likely to have organized groups that are solely focused on these issues. Next is a lack of long-term maintenance. Many of the positive effects on water and habitat quality can actually take over 10 years to be firmly established after a riparian restoration project. And as I mentioned before, riparian restoration is a lot more complicated than just planting some trees and moving on. It takes a much more active long-term involvement to prevent degradation over time, not only from natural causes, but from human interference as well. Next is infrastructural and physical barriers. So this includes things like sidewalks, roads, power lines that physically prevent new vegetation from being planted. And so this is more of a problem in urban areas. I think there are a lot of streams everywhere where there might be a road or a sidewalk or even like a parking lot or something that's right up next to the stream bank. So restoration just wouldn't be possible there. Next is limited opportunities for work on private land. So in general, when you're planning a restoration or a planting project, it's a lot easier to plant on a public park or a public right-of-way. And what's a lot more difficult is either getting permission to work on someone's privately owned land or encourage private landowners to adopt these practices on their own, out of their own free will. And this is a problem because most land along streams, especially in urban areas, is private property. And in fact, 90% of land in Tennessee is privately owned. So even if every single mile of stream and every public park and public right-of-way was completely forested, you're still missing a huge chunk of stream that would remain unprotected without collaboration from landowners. And that leads me right into the most pervasive issue facing river restoration in general, which is a lack of community involvement. And I'd like to note that this isn't just a lack of awareness or due to a lack of awareness or understanding of riparian systems, though that definitely is a factor. Education is really important, but it's the fact that a lot of riparian restoration and river restoration projects in general are done without consultation or collaboration with the people that live in the area where the work is being done. There was this really awesome study done in 2007 called the National River Restoration Synthesis Survey, and they analyzed over 37,000 restoration projects in the US. And one of the most important findings from this study was they found that community involvement was the only factor that they could definitively say was a significant indicator of success. And for their purposes, community involvement just meant involvement from some sort of local volunteer group, like volunteers helping with planting. And I'll dive more into what we specifically mean about community involvement. But this is a really important finding because the aspect of community that is so often missing from riparian restoration has the potential to address a lot of these other issues that I discussed previously. And also with 90% of Tennessee's land being private, you can really see how community buy-in and participation is so essential if we want to make any sort of significant impact on water and habitat quality in our communities. So what even is community involvement? It's a pretty broad term that I feel gets thrown around pretty loosely a lot of the time. But for my purposes, I'm referring not only to groups that help with implementation like volunteers, but also members of the community involved with decision-making and funding right from the start and maintenance and monitoring after. There have been several studies that have found that involving community members in all stages of the restoration or planting process allows this to incorporate their community's values and concerns and really ensures the long-term success of the project. And so people involved in a project in this capacity and who will ultimately benefit from the work being done are referred to as stakeholders. And if I were a project manager and it were my job to recruit stakeholders to help out with a riparian restoration project, my first instinct, like a lot of people, I think, would be to choose people in a way that limits conflict. And when you're looking to limit conflict, you're often choosing groups with 3 characteristics in mind. So these characteristics are legitimacy, urgency, and power. And legitimacy refers to doing what is expected and accepted in a society. Urgency is the drive to complete and take immediate action towards goals, and power is having the knowledge and resources that allow these goals to be achieved. And I'm definitely not going to say that these aspects of stakeholders are not important. They definitely are. But when you're looking in this really narrow scope, when you're recruiting stakeholders, you're limiting your access to the wide array of community resources and support that is at your disposal. And that's so important for the long-term success of your project. So looking outside these circles is really important. And there have actually been several studies that have found that looking outside this criteria for stakeholders is not only good for the project itself, but it has a lot of immediate short-term social benefits as well. So involving members outside this criteria can foster an increased identification with their living space, increasing their sense of responsibility for their environment and their trust between the public and authorities, and allows for social learning. And on a more concrete basis for the project itself, it encourages clearly defined goals and outcomes. It ensures the project will be accepted within a community, and it provides more opportunities for accountability along the way. So to kind of sum up everything that I talked about on the previous 2 slides, although looking outside this criteria for your stakeholders and involving a wider circle of community members that you might not otherwise involve, it takes a lot more communication and outreach and people skills on the front end, which can be really difficult sometimes, but the short-term social benefits for the community itself and the long-term benefits for the project are immeasurable. So switching gears from community for a bit, let's talk about urbanization and why urban areas in particular are uniquely susceptible to riparian buffer impairment, and why they should be prioritized for restoration as opposed to agricultural watersheds that historically have been kind of the target. So in 2018, 82% of the North American population was living in urban areas, and this is projected to keep increasing. And there are so many sources that project that urbanization will be occurring rapidly all over the world. And as our urban areas grow, so do pollutants from our cities that flow as stormwater into our waterways, such as sediment and nutrients. And in addition, development around and even in waterways disrupts and simplifies the natural stream ecosystem, leading to something called urban stream syndrome, which you may or may not have heard of before. But that simply refers to the consistent ecological degradation of streams draining urban land. So urban stream syndrome symptoms include increased and more unpredictable flooding, high concentrations of contaminants, and altered channel stability and morphology. I'm not saying that riparian vegetation is like a magic fix-all solution for all of these problems, but it definitely has the potential to alleviate a lot of these stressors on our waterways. And as our cities are growing, it will become increasingly more important to not only protect riparian zones that are already there, but to incorporate more natural stream habitat into our developed areas. So this is kind of just a simple diagram that kind of sums up what I talked about on the previous slide, but it just shows how urbanization and development has some can have some really negative impacts. I'm not going to say it has to, but it can have some really negative impacts on our waterways. So development in riparian zones leads to increased stormwater pollution, sediment loads, and can increase the likelihood of flooding, and it decreases the biodiversity and resilience of our aquatic systems. And so all of these things kind of tie into each other, but they also happen to be things that a healthy riparian buffer surrounding the urban stream can help remediate. So this leads me to my study area, which is East Tennessee. And Tennessee and the American Southeast in general actually has some of the most biodiverse rivers in the world, which is pretty awesome. This map right here is from a study done a couple years ago by the University of Georgia River Basin Center. And they basically just looked at species richness within waterways in the American Southeast. And this map shows areas with high species richness in red and orange. So Tennessee's right here, and you can tell Tennessee has some incredibly diverse waterways. So that kind of incentivizes us, in my opinion, to protect it a bit more. In addition, Tennessee has some pretty fast growing urban areas like a lot of other places in the world. And this map right here is from population, or according to population projections from the Boyd Center at UT. And this map right here compares 2010 versus 2020 county populations. And the counties with the higher growth rate are shown in this darker blue color. So here's, I think Knox County is this one, kind of hard to tell, but you know, Knox County, surrounding counties, even like Chattanooga, Nashville, definitely Nashville, are growing at a faster rate than some surrounding areas. So because of everything I talked about with urbanization and because of the vast biodiversity that Tennessee has, protecting and restoring riparian zones in East Tennessee and Tennessee in general is extremely important. And in addition, the Tennessee Division of Forestry has highlighted riparian forests as a priority area in their 2020 Forest Action Plan. And this will include not only protecting and preserving functional riparian zones, but also increasing native tree planting within these riparian zones. And the map to the right is from their 2010 Forest Action Plan. And it basically shows watersheds that were deemed to be high need for riparian forest buffers, so that we're lacking in yellow. And I'm going to flip back to this map back here. You know, it's not a perfect match, but you can kind of see some overlap between the yellow areas and these blue areas where there's some urbanization in the urban areas. So again, not a perfect match, but you can tell that there is some connection to urbanization and impaired riparian buffers. So based on this map, the CRRP chose 10 East Tennessee counties to begin our work. So these will be considered our priority counties, and they're listed right here. Just some quick stats I wanted to throw out there about our priority counties. There are almost 8,000 miles of stream. There are about 1,500 or 1,446 miles of urban stream, and there's almost 4,000 miles of forested stream. And when it comes to buffer quality in East Tennessee, there's a lot that we don't know about where we stand and where to begin with widespread restoration efforts. And there might be a lot of local knowledge within some communities about specific areas that are in need of restoration, or have the potential for restoration, but we need to think bigger picture if we're going to make any sort of significant cohesive impact. And the map I showed on the previous slide right here is from 2010. So that is over 10 years ago. So that a lot has changed since then. So continuing to research this and find out where we stand with riparian buffer quality in our urbanizing areas is kind of our goal here. So that leads me to my objectives for my master's thesis research, which will address the issues that we discussed in the previous slides. So first, we're going to assess availability and quality of existing riparian buffer monitoring data in East Tennessee priority counties. We will then identify subwatersheds that should be prioritized for restoration activities based on physical and social parameters. And finally, we will evaluate private residents' willingness to participate in riparian restoration establishment and maintenance on their properties. So for the first objective, I will be collecting and compiling all existing data sources pertaining to buffer quality that we can find. And so we're basically asking the question, what data already exists that can give us an accurate and informative picture of riparian buffer quality in East Tennessee? And as fun as it would be to physically survey every single stream in our area of interest, there are multiple organizations and initiatives that have already collected pertinent buffer data. It's just a matter of compiling it and presenting it in an effective way. So this can include airborne LiDAR vegetation cover, information from the National Land Cover Database, and TDEC water quality and impairment status information. And another important data source that I'd like to talk about is visual stream assessments from multiple separate storm sewer systems, or MS4s for short. So these MS4s, or stormwater departments, are required to complete a certain number of these visual stream assessments within their 5-year permit cycle. And their sampling locations are based on streams that are listed as impaired on the most recent 303D list, and where stormwater is considered their main source of pollution. So there are some drawbacks to using this as a data source. For example, there's no universal methodology for a visual stream assessment technically. So a data set that we would receive from Knox County might look a lot different from one that we received from Hamilton County, just as an example. However, it's really important because in more specific, smaller areas, it can give us a lot more visual information on aspects of buffer impairment that would otherwise be missed by these digital data sources. So these are things like presence of erosion, vegetation quality, and presence of invasive species. So to kind of sum that up, there are some drawbacks, but for smaller specific areas, it can give us some really good visual information. So I just want to show a few charts that have some interesting information comparing urban and non-urban land use within a 100-foot riparian buffer zone. And this is by no means any sort of like official results, but I still think it's a really interesting comparison. So I'm going to show you this chart first, and I'm aware it's very busy, very hard to read, but basically what we're looking at here is different types of land use from the National Land Cover Database. So in red, you have your developed areas. In green, basically you have your forest, and then in yellow, you have agriculture. So this is just our priority counties as a whole. So you can see actually there's a really significant amount of forested buffer and also a lot of agriculture, which isn't the best, but honestly, I was surprised when I looked at this and saw how much of our buffers in these counties were forested. And you can tell at the bottom, there's a little bit of development, but I'd like to compare it to just urban areas. So this is just urban areas, and you can see it looks very, very different from the previous chart. So again, that developed space is shown in red. So you can tell there's a lot more red and a lot less green. And it's kind of intuitive, of course, in urban areas, there's going to be a lot more developed area. So this obviously makes a lot of sense, but something interesting I want to point out is that this developed open space, which is basically it's developed, but it might be just open area. There's a lot of developed open space and developed low intensity areas. So these areas are really good candidates for restoration because there's actually room to put vegetation in. So this is really promising initial kind of analysis. So for our next, oh wait, sorry, I skipped a slide here. Oh, maybe not. Okay, sorry about that. So for our next objective, we will be using data collected from the previous objective, we'll be performing something called a multi-criteria analysis. There we go, where our prioritization parameters in specific areas are chosen based on our desired outcomes. So as an example, a multi-criteria analysis focused solely on nutrient reduction might look at nutrient output, soil type, and land use as the variables of interest. However, our priority is ensuring that restoration is both physically feasible and maximizes social benefits. So for this objective, we'll be narrowing our focus to just one county, So within the buffer zones of streams in a particular county, we'll be assessing the following criteria, kind of rating each variable on a scale. So the first objective, or the first variable that we'll be looking at, are impervious cover and easements inside and outside the buffer zone. So this includes things like sidewalks and roads and just anything that's pavement that's covered. So inside the buffer zone, pavement would present a barrier to restoration, and this would be considered low priority. But outside the buffer zone, having an area with really high impervious cover would be considered high priority because it contributes more stormwater pollutants and also suggests that there's less access to green space. So basically what we're looking for is an area with a high outside to inside ratio of impervious cover. And next we'll be looking at the percent and type of vegetated cover within the buffer zone, and areas that have low forest cover outside and high and open grassy areas inside the buffer zone will be considered high priority. Next, we'll be looking at land use, and because of our emphasis on the community aspect of restoration, we'll be prioritizing residential areas and more specifically high density residential areas if possible, and this will just maximize the social and ecological benefits of restoration. And finally, we'll be looking at water quality data directly related to riparian buffer ecosystem services. So streams listed on TDEC's 303D list with impairment causes of siltation, high nutrient levels, and alteration in streamside vegetative cover will be considered high priority. And this will ensure not only that restoration will achieve maximum benefits for the surrounding communities, but also it's something that is high need for the stream itself. So in order to narrow down areas that show potential for successful restoration, we'll be breaking up the county into sub-watersheds and combining the criteria I just listed on the previous slide. We'll be assigning each watershed a prioritization score. And this is a methodology adapted from a study done by Atkinson in 2020. And it was a really awesome study that focused on prioritizing urban stream corridors for riparian restoration. And their variables of interest were more related to ecosystem services specifically, but I really love the end result, which is this map right here to the right. With sub-watersheds specifically, you can see which ones are high priority versus low priority. And this method is really awesome because it's a great visual tool. It combines multiple important variables into something that's really easy to communicate, and you can kind of manipulate it based on your desired goals for restoration. We will also be performing a Pearson correlation analysis between our quantitative data, such as percentages of impervious cover and different land uses within subwatersheds related to riparian buffer quality, to see if we can identify any connections between variables and spatial relationships. And kind of the goal with this analysis will be to see if there's any sort of predictive ability with our variables of interest and riparian buffer quality. And potentially we might be able to apply this to unassessed areas. And as I said, we'll only be performing the multi-criteria analysis for one of our priority counties. But if we find maybe that certain variables are able to accurately paint a picture of what buffer quality might look like in an area, we could potentially test this on other counties in the future. So finally, when we've narrowed down our high priority restoration zones, we aim to evaluate private residents' willingness to participate in restoration and maintenance on their properties. And because we've determined community to be the most essential aspect of restoration, we're asking the question, do residents want to participate in restoration? And if not, why? So at the end of the day, if you're going to put money, time, and resources into restoring a riparian zone, the residents don't understand why you're doing it and aren't on board, there's very little chance of success. So we will be creating a survey adapted from something called the reasonable person model. And this model was developed specifically to understand people's motivations in participating in environmental restoration projects. It looks at 3 factors that predict a person's involvement. So the three factors are model building, which is the proposed action makes sense within one's current view of the world. And kind of an example of this is some people, based on what they know and have experienced, might think that riparian vegetation looks ugly or even dangerous and might side against planting specific types of vegetation in an area. So to address this concern, you really have to understand what their view is and what a compromise would look like. The next aspect is being effective. Oh, shoot. There we go. The next aspect is being effective, which is the proposed action appeals directly to one's interests and values. So in the way that a restoration project is communicated to a community member, if it doesn't connect to things that they believe are important, the interest and participation is going to be very low because no one wants to spend time on something that doesn't truly matter to them. So it can be a challenge to find ways to communicate why riparian buffers are important in a way that connects with people on a personal level. And the final aspect of this model is meaningful action. So this means that the proposed action will have an immediate and long-lasting positive effect. It's really a huge bummer to volunteer with something and feel like your actions have no impact on your surroundings and are pointless. So it really is essential to address people's concerns and questions about how restoration will positively affect their surroundings and how success will be ensured. So from this survey, we'll hopefully be able to identify trends and reasons why residents decline or want to participate in restoration related to these three factors. And we'll be able to use this information to inform watershed managers within these communities, as well as nonprofits and government agencies, on how they might better allocate resources to promote the long-term success of their projects within their specific community. So to sum up kind of everything I talked about in this presentation, first and foremost, riparian buffers are extremely important and they are essential for healthy communities. And having a healthy buffer protecting your waterway helps in countless ways that we may not even be aware of. Second important point is that urbanization poses a serious threat to buffers, not only in East Tennessee, but in a lot of other places as well. And if we don't learn now how to protect and incorporate more natural forest habitat into our developed spaces, not only our water quality, but our local biodiversity and community resilience will suffer. And speaking of community, it's definitely not just going to be a couple people from the government coming in and planting trees in people's neighborhoods to truly address these issues. In order for any restoration or planting initiative to be truly successful, community involvement is not optional. So making a significant societal impact takes a really long time. So it's best to start now. And finally, there are a lot of question marks when it comes to the current state of East Tennessee's buffers. But with such a large area to cover, it's really hard to know where to begin with widespread restoration. But once we can get an accurate picture of buffer quality and identify some trends, there's a lot we can do with this information in the future. So as for the CRRP, our work is just getting started. So the future, we are looking forward to developing an interactive educational resource for the public to visualize riparian buffer health in their communities. We'll be implementing an educational riparian restoration workshop to be conducted in high need locations. And we'll be networking with watershed and forest management groups in high priority areas to implement planning projects in collaboration with other community groups. And if you would like to stay up to date with what the CRP is working on, which you totally should, more information can be found at riparian.utk.edu. And also, if you want to follow UTK Urban Forestry on Instagram, we'll be posting some updates there as well as other updates on some other urban forestry projects and research that we are working on. I would like to thank the Tennessee Division of Forestry for funding this project and making all of this possible. I'd like to thank my honors committee for their expertise and guidance with this presentation and my research. I'd like to thank my research assistants for the communication aspects of this program. And finally, I would like to say a huge thank you to our community partners who have provided us data so far and networking and collaboration opportunities. Here are my references. I got some photo credits. and I would love to answer any questions.
Thank you, Maddie. That was awesome. Just lost my chat screen. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Here we go. Two questions, and they go together really well, but I'll ask them separately. Okay, so you mentioned that the lack of community involvement is a major issue. What specific organizations and professions should be recruited to help plan and design and implement and monitor an urban riparian restoration project?
That's a really good question. So I kind of mentioned like nonprofits, government agencies, and different like watershed management groups, but I think recruitment of, again, like a wider variety of community groups, like housing associations, even like school groups, community centers, to really educate them on the importance of riparian buffers and how to actually take action themselves and guide them to resources that can help them along the way, will go a really long way. So it's not just these very niche groups that are focusing on ecological restoration that are doing this work. It's all community groups within a community.
Gotcha. So all hands on deck, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, another question. Are there any East Tennessee urban riparian restoration success stories that you could share that you feel others can learn from?
That's actually a really good question. Locally right now, actually, so Third Creek runs right through Knoxville, and I know there's currently kind of a restoration initiative going on there, and they're working to implement more vegetation and kind of build more natural forests around this stream because it's a really urban stream. There's a greenway that goes right along it, so it kind of goes hand in hand with that. But that's one that's local to me that I know about and I've seen some success with, even in the year. I've only been living here a year and I've seen it come pretty far actually. So it's pretty cool.
Janet asked if they may have your email address, Maddie, if you want to put it in the chat. She said, we're in Cumberland County and may have questions later.
Yes.
Those are the only direct questions that I got, but anyone else listening, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or throw another one in the chat, we've got a few more minutes.
Yeah, I just put my email in the chat. So it's Maddy Johnson at utk.edu. So yeah, feel free to reach out anytime with any questions in the future.
While we're waiting for some questions, Alyssa, I was going to ask one. I really liked your point about trying to quantify benefits. We say that the riparians, when they're healthy, they do certain things, but some people are looking more tangible numbers and information. And I saw that chart you showed of the impaired streams in Tennessee and the measurements that were made to show the specific issues. Are there some benefits that a local community can follow after the project is done to show a reduction in some of these negative values? I didn't say that very well, but do you have any advice on how we can do that?
Yeah, you're so right. People really love like concrete evidence that something is working. And unfortunately, kind of with water quality, it's a bit difficult to track. As I said, with riparian restoration, sometimes the beneficial effects on water quality can take up to 10 years to even be visible or evident. So something that I would recommend to people who are looking to kind of quantify the success of a restoration project in like the more short term would be to just look around at the local biodiversity that adding more diverse vegetation along a stream bank can allow. And it can be small things like, I always like to look for how many different types of like pollinators I can find in a restoration zone, and that's really cool to see. But also with like the stream habitat, adding more vegetation within the stream provides habitat for some really small like macroinvertebrates within the stream. So just small things like that, just looking around and observing how the biodiversity in an area is changing can be really encouraging.
Okay, good point.
I think someone asked a question in the chat. What are the best type of native grasses for riparian zones? So I don't know a ton about grasses. I'm gonna be honest about that, but we do have so I'm gonna put the link to our website, riparian.utk.edu in the chat. And we have a list of resources that are related to like different plant types that are best for riparian zones. And one really excellent resource that I would recommend that's on the Tennessee Division of Forestry's website. And maybe I can find that link and send that in the chat as well, but it's on our website too. But it's the Urban Riparian Buffer Handbook. And it basically is just everything you need to know about riparian zones and what to do if you have a riparian zone that you want to restore, and kind of how to go about that entire process. And that handbook has a lot of really good recommendations for grasses and trees as well. So I definitely recommend checking that out. You're welcome.
Okay. Do we have any more questions or comments? All right.
Not so far in the chat.
All right. Well, we'll wrap this up, and there's still have a little time if you're putting your thoughts together now while we have Maddie with us. But I do want to thank her for, I think, just an outstanding presentation. It improved my perspective, Maddie, of riparian restoration, that there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done beforehand, during, and even after. I hadn't thought about that, to make this a long-term effort, and that's the way we need to approach these projects. So that was very good, and I tell you what, I think all of us will look forward to the resources that you're going to be making available to us at the website address you gave us, and the educational workshops. And we are expecting you to let us know when you've reached the next stage and you have something you want to share with the rest of the state. We'd love to have you back.
Yes, absolutely. We'll be doing a lot more work over the summer, so definitely be sharing some updates. And I just put the link for the Riparian Buffer Handbook in the chat for anyone who's interested to take a look.
Okay. Okay. All right. With that, Alyssa, what do we have next? We want to share with the folks. There we go. Our next speaker. We always kind of shift gears from month to month to keep you guessing, I guess, more than anything, to make it interesting. But next month, June 16th, I believe, at the same time, we're going to have Megan Mullinax, who's with ACRT, and she's going to address an issue regarding trees and utilities and help us understand the approach they take in utility vegetative management. Now, I will say, in a lot of times, this is a controversial issue with a lot of communities, but if we're not working together and understanding the issues involved and what's in it for everybody, and we all need safe and reliable electricity service, and we also have to have our trees, we need to find ways of working together. Megan's going to show us and tell us about ways we can do that. So I hope you'll be able to join us, and it has been approved for an ISA CEU. And we'll have more information on that later. That's our next speaker. So with that, I want to thank Maddie again for an outstanding presentation. Lisa, if there's nothing else, oh, I say CEUs. If you need your CEU and didn't enter your information during registration, you just send that to Alyssa and she'll handle it from there. And I'll give folks a second to see that email address if they need to jot it down. But thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Alyssa. And thank all of you for participating and joining us in today's webinar. See you next month.